Imagine, it is May 1884. Ulysses S. Grant is 62 years old, and he's sitting in a Manhattan townhouse, and he has just discovered that he is completely, utterly wiped out financially.
Yeah, it is just a staggering image when you really picture it. I mean, this is the venerated national hero, right? The man who saved the Union, a two-term former president.
Right.
And suddenly, out of nowhere, he is facing this humiliating, absolute ruin.
And it wasn't just like a bad investment. He was the victim of a massive Wall Street Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, run by a guy named Ferdinand Ward.
Exactly, Ferdinand Ward. The press actually called this guy the young Napoleon of Wall Street, which is wild. So Ward had partnered with Grant's son to create this brokerage firm, Grant and Ward. And he basically told investors, he had secret access to lucrative government contracts because of Grant's name.
But there were no contracts.
None. Zero. It was just a classic pyramid setup. He was paying early investors with fresh cash from the new ones, and Grant was just totally oblivious to the whole thing.
Totally in the dark.
So when the music stopped, Grant was left bankrupt. I mean, he had less than $200 in liquid assets to his name.
Wow. And, the sheer heartbreak of this moment is really captured in what Grant does next. Because before the collapse became public, he desperately tried to save the firm.
Right. He goes to William H. Vanderbilt.
Yeah, the railroad magnate. He takes out a $150,000 personal loan. But when the firm collapsed anyway, Grant was legally bankrupt. But he was driven by this profound, almost inflexible sense of personal honor.
Right.
So he visits Vanderbilt to settle the debt the only way he possibly could.
By handing over his most prized possessions. We are talking about his Civil War battle swords, his military uniforms, his congressional gold medals.
It's so sad. Vanderbilt didn't even want them. He tried to refuse them, but Grant just insisted.
It is incredibly gut-wrenching. But here is where this story takes a crazy turn. Enter Mark Twain.
Yeah, Mark Twain. So Twain and Grant had actually become friends. And Twain finds out Grant is about to sign this standard trade publishing contract to write his memoirs.
Because he needs the money.
Desperately. But the publisher was only offering a 10% royalty, which, was typical, but Twain was absolutely outraged. He knew the historical value of what Grant possessed. So Twain steps in, stops the deal, and establishes a direct partnership with Grant, offering a 70% net profit split.
70%. And the way they sold it is fascinating. They used subscription publishing. Because, in the 1880s, most American towns didn't have brick and mortar bookstores.
Right, you couldn't just go down to the local shop.
Exactly. So Twain deploys an absolute army of over 10,000 Union veteran canvassers. These men went door to door, carrying sample pages, selling subscriptions to their former commander's life story.
Which brings us to the actual physical act of writing these memoirs. He's at this cottage on Mount McGregor in upstate New York, and it is a heroic composition process because Grant is dying.
Yeah, he has advanced squamous cell carcinoma of the throat, probably from a lifetime of smoking cigars.
And the descriptions of his condition are just horrifying.
I read that just swallowing water felt like swallowing liquid fire to him. He was in absolute agony. He was prescribed this topical cocaine water to numb his throat just so he could eat, but he explicitly refuses heavy narcotics.
Right, because he knew opiates would fog his memory.
Yeah, and he needed his mind razor sharp to finish the book and save his family.
It's incredible. Eventually, the cancer just destroys his vocal cords completely. He loses his voice entirely. So he's sitting on the porch of this cottage, wrapped in blankets, and he's communicating only through these scribbled little paper slips.
Just furiously writing.
Furiously. And he does it. He finishes the personal memoirs just 5 days before his death on July 23rd, 1885.
It really is one of the most profound paradoxes you will ever encounter in history. I mean, a dying, bankrupt man channels his final agonizing months into a literary masterpiece. And the result? That masterpiece nets over $450,000 for his widow, Julia.
Which is the equivalent of millions in today's world.
Exactly. It effectively rescued his family and cemented his historical legacy forever.
It is just an incredible triumph born out of total devastation.
You're listening to Deep Cuts and Deep Thinking. Today, our mission in this deep dive is to unpack the incredible, paradoxical life of the man who saved the Union, fought for civil rights, and was ultimately victimized by both Wall Street conmen and historical revisionists. Because to understand how Grant had the superhuman stoicism to write his memoirs while dying of cancer, we have to look backward. We have to look at the decade before the Civil War.
That is really where he built this psychological immunity to panic, because his early life wasn't, some steady, inevitable march to greatness. It was actually defined by reluctance and failure.
He didn't even want to go to West Point, right?
Yeah, no, his father essentially forced him. And later, during the Mexican-American War, he harbored these profound moral misgivings about the conflict. He actually viewed it as an unjust war of conquest to expand slavery.
But the irony is that Mexican-American War is where he learned exactly how an army operates.
Yes, as a quartermaster.
Right. It's not glorious work. He wasn't out there leading glorious cavalry charges. He was figuring out how to move thousands of mules, wagons, and supply trains across hostile terrain. He learned the logistical reality of how to feed and supply an army, which, as we know, is what actually wins wars.
But then that military career just stalls out completely. He ends up stationed at Fort Humboldt in Northern California.
Which was incredibly desolate.
Very desolate. He was separated from his wife and children for years, and the isolation just crushed him. Ultimately, he resigns from the Army amidst allegations of heavy drinking.
And that leads right into what historians refer to as his 7 lean years between 1854 and 1861. He goes back to Missouri, tries to farm a tract of land, and he literally names the farm Hardscrabble.
That tells you how well it was going.
Right. It fails miserably. And when farming didn't work, he resorted to cutting and selling firewood on the street corners of St. Louis just to feed his family.
That image is so striking. People who had known him as a military officer would see him on the street wearing this faded old Army overcoat, literally selling wood.
He eventually hits absolute rock bottom and has to ask his father for a job. He ends up clerking at his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois for $60 a month. But there is this crucial, defining moment during this desperate period.
Oh, this is such a key story.
It really is. On March 29th, 1859, Grant goes to the St. Louis courthouse. He had acquired an enslaved man named William Jones from his father-in-law. Now, Grant is entirely broke. He could have sold William Jones for an estimated $1,000.
Which would have instantly solved his financial crisis.
Instantly. But he doesn't. Instead, he illegally frees him. He files manumission papers. He walks away from life-changing money because his core moral compass wouldn't allow him to profit from selling a human being.
It tells you everything about his character. He was willing to live in poverty rather than violate his conscience.
Think about Grant's pre-war life, like a modern startup founder who, fails spectacularly, loses everyone's money, and ends up sleeping on a friend's couch. In today's world, society often equates those early struggles with permanent inadequacy. We just write people off. But for Grant, because he had been stripped of all pretension and had already survived rock bottom, he was practically immune to the fear of failure. And that is the exact trait required to lead an army.
That lack of fear is everything. When you have already lost everything, the prospect of failure just doesn't paralyze you anymore. Those failures were the essential training ground for his resilience.
Which perfectly explains his rapid rise when the Civil War actually breaks out. That unique psychological resilience allowed him to remain perfectly calm under fire. In the Western theater, he fundamentally changes the momentum of the war.
Yeah, at the capture of Fort Donelson.
Right. The Confederate commander asks for terms of capitulation, and Grant replies that no terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted.
That phrase made him a national hero overnight. They started saying U.S. Grant stood for Unconditional Surrender Grant.
And then you have the Battle of Shiloh on April 6th, 1862. This is where you really see that psychological armor at work.
It is total chaos. The Confederates launch a massive surprise attack at dawn. Union lines are breaking, men are fleeing in terror. At the end of the first day, it looks like a catastrophic defeat. It is pouring rain, and Grant is standing under a tree, smoking a cigar, his hat pulled down against the water.
Just totally unfazed.
Completely. His subordinate, William T. Sherman, walks up to him, deeply rattled, and says, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?"
And Grant doesn't flinch. He is just ice cold. He takes the cigar out of his mouth and simply says, "Yes. Lick him tomorrow, though."
Lick him tomorrow. I love that.
And he did. He assessed the situation, reorganized his lines, ordered the counterattack, and won the battle the next day.
He didn't panic when the board flipped. And you see that same operational brilliance during the Vicksburg campaign in 1863. Vicksburg was this Confederate fortress on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. It seemed basically impregnable. Grant tries for months to take it from the north and just fails. So he does something incredibly risky.
Explain how he actually pulled that off, because it honestly sounds impossible when you read about it.
Well, he marched his army down the western side of the river while simultaneously sending his wooden naval gunboats straight past the heavy Confederate batteries at night.
Wow.
It was a terrifying run under heavy fire, but the boats made it. Once his army crossed the river south of the city, he completely severed his own supply line.
Right, which goes against every rule of military doctrine at the time. You just don't abandon your supply wagons.
Exactly, but he relied on those quartermaster skills he learned back in Mexico. He realized his army could live off the land. They moved fast, foraging from local plantations, capturing livestock, and freeing enslaved people as they went.
So he untethers his army.
Right. By untethering his army from a slow supply chain, he became totally unpredictable. He won 5 separate battles in 18 days and captured the fortress. It is still studied today as an operational masterpiece.
But, despite all of this brilliance, he still gets tagged with the butcher myth, this idea that he was just this blunt instrument who threw men into meat grinders without any tactical thought.
Yes, and that is a myth that was heavily propagated after the war by Confederate writers like Jubal Early. They really needed to explain away Robert E. Lee's defeat, so they painted Grant as a butcher who only won by sheer numerical advantage. But, if you look at the raw data, it tells a very different story.
What do the numbers actually say?
Lee actually sustained a higher percentage of casualties relative to the forces he fielded. During their commands, Lee averaged about 7,000 casualties a month compared to Grant's 3,600.
That's a massive difference. And Grant's strategy in 1864 wasn't mindless attrition. It was a synchronized, multi-theater grand strategy. Before Grant took overall command, Union armies operated independently, which allowed the Confederates to shift reinforcements using interior rail lines.
Right, they were playing whack-a-mole.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Grant stopped that. He applied continuous, simultaneous pressure on all fronts so the Confederacy couldn't breathe. But we can't ignore the sheer scale of the bloodletting in the Overland Campaign. I mean, at the Battle of Cold Harbor on June 3rd, we are talking about 7,000 Union casualties in under an hour.
It was horrific, yes.
Soldiers were literally pinning slips of paper with their names and addresses to the backs of their coats because they knew they were walking into a slaughter and wanted their bodies identified. Grant himself admitted in his memoirs that it was the one charge he regretted. So for the people reading the newspapers back in 1864, seeing those endless casualty lists, doesn't the butcher label make complete sense psychologically?
Oh, absolutely. Psychologically, to the Northern public, it was horrifying. The volume of death was entirely unprecedented in American history. They were reacting to mass trauma, so the label is deeply understandable. But analytically, the high casualties were the result of a shift in the nature of warfare itself.
Because of the technology.
Right. Grant was fighting the transition into modern war. The invention of the rifled musket meant defenders behind entrenched earthworks had a massive advantage. Frontal assaults became deadly in a way they just hadn't been 10 years earlier. The tragedy was the grim reality of destroying an entrenched enemy, not a lack of strategy on Grant's part.
So he grinds down the Confederacy, wins the war, and rides that immense popularity straight into the White House. He is elected as the 18th president under the slogan, "Let us have peace," and he essentially transitions from fighting a conventional rebel army to battling domestic terrorism.
Right, let us have peace was his goal. But he recognized that peace in the South required federal enforcement. Southern states were violently resisting Reconstruction and disenfranchising newly freed black citizens. So Grant aggressively pushed for the ratification of the 15th Amendment to constitutionally protect black voting rights.
And this leads to what I think is one of his most massive, yet completely overlooked achievements, the creation of the Department of Justice in 1870. Before this, there was no centralized federal law enforcement agency.
It was a revolutionary step. Grant appointed Amos T. Ackerman as his attorney general, and together they utilized the newly passed enforcement acts, specifically the Ku Klux Klan Act.
How did that actually work on the ground? Because it sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It was. The problem was that local Southern courts and sheriffs were either terrified of the Klan or actively in the Klan themselves. You just couldn't get a conviction at the state level. The Klan Act allowed the federal government to intervene. Grant declared martial law in 9 South Carolina counties. And crucially, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus.
Meaning, federal troops could arrest suspected Klan members and hold them without local sympathetic judges immediately demanding their release.
Precisely. The federal government secured hundreds of convictions. By using the Department of Justice and federal troops, Grant effectively shattered the first iteration of the Ku Klux Klan as an organized terrorist force. It was the high watermark for federal civil rights enforcement in the 19th century.
But this raises an enormous question for me. If he literally crushed the Ku Klux Klan, how is an achievement that monumental completely erased from the public's general knowledge of Grant for over a century?
Well, because the man who could outmaneuver Robert E. Lee and crush the Klan was tragically defenseless against a different kind of enemy, corrupt politicians and Wall Street con men in his own camp.
It really is the great paradox of his presidency. He was fiercely, personally honest. He never took a bribe, but his administration became synonymous with Gilded Age corruption.
The scandals were constant. You had the whiskey ring scandal, where distillers bribed Treasury agents to evade taxes. Grant's own personal secretary, Orville Babcock, was indicted in the scheme. And because of his blind loyalty, Grant provided a deposition that actually helped acquit Babcock.
Wow.
Then there was the Belknap Post-Trader scandal, where his Secretary of War was taking kickbacks. Grant accepted Belknap's resignation just minutes before the House could impeach him, basically shielding his friend from consequence.
And we can't forget the Black Friday gold panic on September 24th, 1869. This perfectly illustrates how he was manipulated. Financiers Jay Gould and James Fisk wanted to corner the gold market. To do that, they needed to make sure the federal government wouldn't release its gold reserves and drive the price down.
So how do they stop the government? They manipulate the president.
Exactly. They used Grant's own brother-in-law to get close to him, subtly trying to convince Grant that high gold prices were good for Western farmers. So Gould and Fisk start buying up all the gold, the price skyrockets, and the economy starts to crash.
It was a disaster.
It isn't until Grant finally realizes he's being played that he orders the Treasury to dump $4 million in federal gold onto the market, breaking the conspiracy but causing a financial panic in the process.
We also have to acknowledge his darkest decision, which happened during the war but shadowed his presidency. General Orders Number 11. In 1862, frustrated by illegal cotton trading in his military district, Grant issued a sweeping anti-Semitic order expelling Jewish people as a class from the territory.
It was horrific. Families were literally forced onto trains. Abraham Lincoln immediately revoked the order when he found out. Now, to Grant's credit, he realized the magnitude of his mistake and spent the rest of his life and his presidency trying to atone for it.
Right. He appointed a record number of Jewish Americans to federal office.
Yeah, and vigorously condemned anti-Semitism. But the stain of that order remains a stark failure of judgment.
It really does.
When you look at all this, Grant's worldview is like a brilliant chess grandmaster who assumes everyone is playing by the same visible rules on the board. In that environment, against an enemy army, he is a genius. But that mindset made him completely helpless when he sat down at a poker table, which is essentially what Gilded Age politics and Wall Street were.
Oh, that's the perfect analogy.
At a poker table, bluffing, lying, and hidden hands are the norm. Ferdinand Ward's Ponzi scheme worked years later because Grant fundamentally could not comprehend that a friend would look him in the eye and just lie to him.
He constantly projected his own honesty onto people who had none. And because of those incredible highs and those embarrassing administrative lows, Grant's legacy became the perfect battleground for historians. His reputation was drastically shifted by whoever was holding the pen.
The trajectory of his historical ranking is wild. When he died in 1885, he was universally revered. His funeral procession in New York City had 1.5 million spectators.
Insane.
Union and Confederate generals literally acted as pallbearers together.
Yeah, but then comes the severe decline. In the early 20th century, you have the rise of the Dunning School. This was a group of influential historians, largely out of Columbia University, who essentially codified the lost cause narrative into academic textbooks.
They actively rewrote history.
Completely. They framed Reconstruction as this tragic era where vindictive Northerners and corrupt officials forced unnatural racial equality onto the defeated South.
So by centering the narrative entirely on the corruption scandals of Grant's administration and framing his enforcement of civil rights as tyrannical overreach, they systematically degraded his reputation. They taught generations of Americans that he was just a drunken butcher and a failed president. It got so bad that he was ranked number 33 in the year 2000 CS-PAN presidential poll.
But history is never static. In the 21st century, we have seen a massive rehabilitation of Grant. Driven by thorough modern historical analysis, like Ron Chernow's biography, historians began reevaluating his civil rights achievements. They looked at his destruction of the Klan and his defense of black voting rights. Because of that new lens, Grant rose all the way back to number 20 by the year 2021.
And it wasn't just his politics that required defending. Remember the memoirs he wrote while dying. Mark Twain actually had to defend Grant's literary genius against British critics, like Matthew Arnold, who complained about Grant's grammar.
Oh, the critics are always there.
Always. Twain argued that Grant's plain, direct, unpretentious style was a masterpiece of clarity. Grant didn't use flowery Victorian language. He wrote exactly how he thought. And in doing so, he fundamentally changed American nonfiction literature.
Which brings us back to what this all means for you, the listener. Grant's shifting legacy reminds us that historical reputation is often just a political artifact. The truth of a historical figure usually tells us way more about the values of the society doing the ranking than it does about the person themselves.
When a society values maintaining a certain racial hierarchy, Grant is painted as a villain and a corrupt fool. When a society values civil rights enforcement and federal protection of vulnerable citizens, Grant is elevated as a hero. The underlying facts of his life, the battles, the laws, the scandals, they didn't change.
No, the cultural lens through which we view them did. We always like to think we're reading the final draft of history, but the ink is never truly dry. Every generation rewrites the story based on what they need from the past.
Which leaves us with something deep to mull over today. If the brilliant architect of the Union victory, the man who created the Department of Justice, could be reduced to a simple-minded, drunken punchline for nearly a century just because his civil rights policies fell out of favor, who else in the world we're living in now are we entirely misjudging? What modern figures will look completely different to historians a century from now when the cultural lenses shift yet again?
It really makes you question every historical absolute you were ever taught in school.
If you found this podcast interesting, please like and subscribe.